All right, so when we look at the nature of stability, like the notes covered, it's sometimes better to get a visual representation of what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and look at it. We'll take 3 different states. Now when you look at these, look at the ball and look at the stability of the ball. That's what we're talking about here. Is we want to imagine this is a tennis ball. You can put it in your backyard. You can actually do this yourself. This is indifferent. Why is it indifferent? Well, we talk about the forces that are acting on the body. At this point, there's no forces acting on the body. There's nothing making it move one way or the other. There's nothing preventing it from moving one way or the other. It's completely indifferent. Right here is unstable. Why is that unstable? Well, there's no forces acting upon it, but you can see at any point it can go back and forth. It can go whichever direction that you want to push it, whichever way you want to force it. And then you have stable. Stable, we're talking about maximum amount of friction. Right here, you have a minimal amount of friction. This is really all you have. Here, you have all of this that can come into play for the friction. But here, you have a maximum amount because it's covering the entire thing. So this has nowhere to go. Its center mass can't travel outside of that area. Here, its center mass can go anywhere we want it to go. Here, it's a very minimal area that it can actually move. So this is the nature of what our movement is day to day. When we look at equilibrium, we have stability. Stability is either indifferent, unstable, or stable. So I'm going to call my good training partner in, Scott, come in here. Let me show you what we're talking about. So just face this way, face the camera. And right now he's in a stable state. He's just relaxed. Go ahead and turn this way a little bit more. No, this way. This way. There you go. All right, put both your feet together. Completely together. There we go. At this point, he's got to move. He has to stabilize. Keep your feet together. Or he's going to be in an unstable state of equilibrium. Put your feet shoulder width apart, right there. Here, he's not going to move it anywhere at all. Now put your feet all the way out as far as you possibly can. Here, he's definitely not going to move anywhere. But there's a problem. Just stay right there, right where you are. When we look at this right here, we look at that minimum area with their unstable state. That even though he is very wide right now, forward, he's very unstable. If he's pushed, he has that very little area that he's going to move. You can come back up. So when you look at it, okay, stand up fully, stand on one foot. Put your foot up as high as you can. Now we're in a very unstable state. The reason for that is this right here. He can go anywhere that I want to push him. At this point, he has minimal contact with the ground. He's going to go in that direction. So when you think about, you can put it down. When you think about movement, you think about working with somebody while they're moving towards you, the more that they get on one foot, the more susceptible they are to being moved in whichever way you want them to be. If they're just standing there completely normal, they're indifferent. You can't really do anything. You have to force them. You have to create a force to make them move. If they've already assumed a wide stance, you've got to do something to create an unstable state in them because they're very stable right now. You either have to push them, pull them. You have to act in such a way in order to do that. So when we talk about the states of equilibrium, unstable, stable, and indifferent, this is a physical representation of what we're talking about. Now let's look at it a little bit more in depth. We're going to look at center mass, and then we're going to look at the angle of stability, then we're going to look at a physical representation of it. So if we have our good friend Kenny here that you've seen in the notes that you've been looking at. And this is quick and dirty. The notes have given you a lot more information than what I'm about to give you. I just want to give you some of my little takes on it. So he's existing in a three-dimensional space out here. That line goes through, obviously. So you have gravity acting down. You have the internal support structure pushing up against it. You have external mechanical force that could actually force him to move in such a way, okay? So these are some of the forces that are moving on the body. And then you have just general force that can act on the body like air. You don't have to push anybody if it's 120 miles per hour outside with the winds. The way that I like to describe center mass, especially when you're working with one of your students and they go, man, I don't know what you're talking about, and it kind of doesn't make sense to me, is even though the notes say that the sum of all the body parts create, gravity assigns weight, which is mass, to each body part, and the sum of all those meets in the center area, which is right in here, right below the navel. The way I like to describe it is that your internal support structure is pushing up and gravity is pushing down. The sum of those two coming together meets in a center point. That's the easiest way to describe it to somebody that doesn't know what you're talking about when you start talking about gravity assigning mass to body parts. That creates what is called a line of gravity. So when you look at center mass, you have to look at where it is in the body. If you have no legs, you have no center mass. You do, but it's higher up, and it relies on the nubs down here, if you had nubs, to actually keep your body up. So you do have a center mass, even if you have no legs, because you have an internal support structure. You have that muscular skeletal system. And you still have gravity acting on you to, assign your body parts mass. But when you're working with your students, this is the best way to describe it as center mass, and that's where we're going to be. Now, one of the things that you want to remember is that center mass is different on everybody, but not as much as you think it would be. The reason that I say that is because some people will tell you center mass up here, and some people tell you center mass down there. Anywhere between these 2 points, if you assign in your mind a point on their body as a representation of center mass, either of these two is going to be fine. I've had over time people tell me, Matt, you're completely wrong on center mass because it's actually 3 inches above the dot what you're talking about. These are the same people that have fake hips and knees and spend 30 years with fake shoulders being thrown around in judo trying to figure out what equilibrium is. So don't pay attention to people like that when they tell you that you're wrong because it's 2 inches. There's big boy rules, and we don't have to put up with that type of stuff. Remember, this area right here, internal support pushing up, gravity pushing down. Once we apply an external mechanical force is when we get this moving. The only thing that gets this moving is either it moves itself or something moves it. You have that center mass, that point in the middle, so you can see where we're going, which is a paper cut that I just got on my hand. You can see where we're going with this, which is we have to look at how to apply external mechanical force to get that center mass moving. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and look at friction and load-bearing area. So you have the ground, and you have points of contact with the ground that are called feet. Feet, let's draw it out this way. When we look at friction, say this is the ground right here. When your feet are in contact with the ground, you have a maximum amount of friction. But think about somebody that is standing on their tiptoes. Very little friction. Somebody that is only on their heel. Very little friction. Somebody that is actually fully in contact with the ground, that's where you're going to have friction. What that creates is called a load-bearing area. Why is that called a load-bearing area? Because it is bearing a load. It is bearing the internal support structure that's fighting gravity. So those points of friction create that load-bearing area. Once you have friction, you can support the body. When you're up in space, you really don't have a whole lot of friction. If you look at an oily ground, there's not a lot of friction with the ground. So what happens? That center mass starts moving all over the place because there's no friction to support the load-bearing area. The load-bearing area is the area between the feet and the ground, where you have your friction. So if I can get Scott to come over here for a second, this is what we're looking at. Turn this way. Right here. The point between this toe, around the foot, and then his heels is the load-bearing area for him. That bears all the load up. When the center mass starts to move outside of that load-bearing area, you can guess what happens, which is the body becomes unstable. Put both your feet together. That is much less stable than what we were looking at a moment ago, because look at how small the load-bearing area is now. It's this big, okay? So I want you to visually represent, or take a picture that's in your mind. Put your feet out. Complete, now you have all this space. That's why you really have to look at your stance, what you're doing with your feet during your stance. If you have a stance that put your feet together, like that, that's not very stable. Take your toe, put it here, and put your heel here, like this. Now you have a very strange one, because you have a big triangle going on. You've got one on his heel, and you've got here. So he's not stable at all. One of the keys that you'll find in working with people, you can just put your feet on. One of the keys that you'll find in working with people is that if you look at their stance and you look at your footwork, or look at their footwork, you can determine what their equilibrium will be. What state are they going to be in? If somebody takes a horse stance, take a horse stance. There, it looks very stable, but think about how thin this load-bearing area is. So that center mass, if it's right here in the middle, once it moves outside, the body's going to have to adjust. Come back up. There, you have much better, because instead of being stretched out along a long way, you have a very small area that it's stretched out, and it's more stable. Bring it all the way back in. This is the worst that you can possibly have. The reason your horse stance is so bad is because it limits mobility, but it also tends to create a very long, wide, but narrow load-bearing area. So optimally, the way that you're designed is the same way that you would walk. Just stand normal. Like, turn around 3 times and then just stand however you want. There. That is a natural stance. Most people don't think about that. That is your natural load-bearing area that you will assume when you get out of bed in the morning. When you get out of bed in the morning, you don't like get up on your foot. You don't do this. I know I'm going way off cue here. You don't wake up in the morning and go, and get out of bed. The reason you don't do that is because your body wants to be stable. You don't get out of bed and assume a horse stance. You don't get out of bed and assume a T stance. In fencing, you don't get out of bed and assume some weird-ass stance. You assume the stance that supports the load that your body's used to carrying. If it does that, then that's where you want to make your fighting stance. You can work off of it as a basis. Now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep moving, but think about your load-bearing area. Work with your friends. Have them do crazy things. Have them stand like this. See how unstable it is. And then think about the idiocy that you see in some martial arts with the footwork that they use. Coefficient of stability is an interesting thing, because I see a lot of times people demonstrate it, but they don't know what they're demonstrating. I think it's valuable for you to learn it in terms of equilibrium and in terms of force applied on a body, but I don't think it is dogmatic in that if you don't know it or understand it, you'll fail. It's simply the concept of what happens when you apply force to a body. So basically, and the reason that we do these lectures, these short lectures for all of this stuff, is that you have things that you can ask questions about, and say, well, what about this and what about that in these discussion forums, and be able to know what we're talking about here. Basically what we're looking at is that the coefficient of stability, we're looking at when force applied to the body, how much force is required in order to make that body unstable. So you have to look at what the body is going to do in order to create stability. So if the coefficient, if the force is less than 1, then the body is going to remain stable. So what that means is that if you're applying force to the body that's less, come over here, Scott, that's less than what the body is pushing back, scoot over just a little bit, okay? So right now, don't resist me at all. That's no resistance at all. So that my force is more than what he will generally resist. So my force that I'm applying to him is more than what his actual body weight is, because if I actually took the sum of all this mass and pushed it up against him, it would just run into a brick wall if he resisted. But if he doesn't resist at all, then whenever I contact him, pushing that area makes the rest of the chain move, which we talk about in combative biomechanics in one of the other courses. So when he resists, here, I have to push more in order to overcome him. So at that point, I have to be more than one. If I'm just standing here with my hand on and not applying anything, then I'm equal to. If he pushes back against me, push back as hard as you can. Then I have to create more force to get him out. Now, what happens is, and what we'll look at, you're good, is that as the person applies it back, especially when we look at grasps and grabs in some of the other courses, as we look at force resistance and going with resistance. And it comes back to the coefficient of stability. Because what it does is it creates, when he pushes back against me here, it creates in his mind, his calculations say, well, I'm not going anywhere because I'm pushing him against him, I'm resisting. When we move with the resistance, then it makes him have to completely change his mindset and make a decision on what to do. What his body will do is now it wants to become stable. So it will compensate, dampen, or balance, which is what we're going to look at. It's one of those things that you know innately that if I push somebody, I have to push them harder than what their resistance is to make them unstable. But the reason that we want to teach it is to make sure that you understand that when it comes to resisting force and what these numbers are, that you can play with them if you understand the physics, especially in grappling or in pushing matches or whatever. You can play with the physics and set things up and let them come back and work with them in order to get the result that you
keep asking.
So you're pushing me this way, so your force is say a 30. And I have to apply just as much force back to be in a state of equilibrium.
Correct.
What if you're applying force this way, 3, and I'm applying force that way, and you take that and use it against me? Would that be a 6?
Would that be a 6?
Yeah.
If you look at Hooke's law, we're almost at a 6 when you look at elasticity. That would be just taking it back the other way.
Right, and then using it against me.
Not really. Not if you would end up, the moment that, let's say you go, you do it, right? I apply a 3. You apply a 3 back. Now we're back at 0. Now you're having to apply more force than I'm applying to you. Apply force. Now you're winning. Okay? So now we're going this way. If you're given a 3 and I'm given a 2, but I pick it up to a 4 and push it back, we're back to 0.
Okay.
The only way we can take all of that is to basically change completely the plane that it's working at and take the force that's being applied and then redirect that force into another direction, which we'll get to in movement in 3 planes. Okay. So you're right and you're almost there. The primary issue with it is that you have 2 bodies acting in opposite directions. It's very difficult to get them to come back to one point and then go all the way. You would almost need a third party to take your energy once it's coming back, overcome me, and then pull me along in order to get it.
That makes sense.
Make sense?